Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to call the meeting to order. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. It's awfully cold, so I appreciate you coming in and spending some time with us, people up there in the gallery. Before we get started, I'd first like to just address something that I didn't address at our last meeting, and that was, it was an unintentional but unprofessional oversight on my part, and as I took over the position of chair, I inadvertently forgot to thank Councillor Squire for his leadership for the year. And Councillor Squire, I hope you accept my apology, and thank you so much for your leadership. Moving on, do we have any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, okay. So we'll move right ahead into the scheduled items. And Ms. Ramsey.
All right, well, thank you to the working group, and I guess welcome back to our first meeting of 2018. So happy New Year, I guess. First off, I just wanted to again thank everybody and maybe introduce myself again for anyone that's watching from home that maybe hasn't heard who I am yet, but I'm Jenny Ramsey. I'm the project director for Rapid Transit for the City of London, and I'm here to lead this project through to its implementation. So since the last time our working group met, we've been really busy trying to move forward our project on a number of fronts. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to give you a high-level update on the work that we've been doing and what's coming down the pipe. So I'm very excited today to have a panel of transit experts from across Canada and the US here to talk to us about their experiences in implementing BRT in other cities. Our project team was fortunate to spend the day with these transit experts, learning about what's worked for them, what challenges they've seen in their projects in other cities, and helping to get their eyes and insight on our BRT project. So it's been really helpful for our team to be able to get their feedback and expertise, and I'm sure that many of you will have lots of great questions for them as well. We're going to have a question period later on in our agenda today. So first off, I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind people about how to get in touch with us in the Rapid Transit Implementation Office. So whether it's a question or a comment, anyone can always email us at shift@london.ca. We have a number now that we've created, which is a general line for our office, which again allows you to be able to get to the people that you want to talk to. So when you call that general line, it'll give you choices and options to be able to direct your inquiry to the right people, whether it's a property inquiry or just a general question or comment. So that's a new resource that we've been trying to get that number out there and help people know how to get in touch with us. And of course, people can also drop by our office at the Central Library in City Plaza, just across from CBC. We've actually got signage now, so you can see us when you walk by. So the team's been extremely busy since the last time we met, and I thought I'd catch you up on some of those key milestones. The last time we got together as a group was just ahead of our 5th Public Information Center group of sessions. So in all, we hosted 9 meetings in locations across the city through December and January. And we wanted to make sure we gave Londoners as much opportunity to come out and learn about the BRT design options throughout the corridors, share their ideas and thoughts and concerns, and provide their comment on the different options. And we wanted, again, give them as many opportunities to find a time that worked for them. During these last public information centers, we were able to show the public a variety of options for how the BRT might look along the corridors. Through our presentation and display boards, they were able to really get a good sense for how those different options, whether center running or curbside, what the number of lanes would look like, and how that might work in their neighborhoods, and help them to better understand what the impacts and benefits of those different options would be. So our main goal was to collect their thoughts on the different options so that we could consider those that input and feedback when we do our technical review against our various criteria, with the goal of coming up with preferred engineering design. The information sessions presented concepts for 9 key areas of our BRT network. In some areas, we showed different options side by side and balanced the benefits and impacts of those different options. In other areas, we had a single option, which was our only technically preferred option, but we gave the opportunity for people to provide feedback to help us refine those designs in those areas. We had excellent turnout through our sessions, and we were really pleased with the tremendous turnout and feedback that we saw at each of the 9 sessions. So over and all, we had more than 750 people come out, and they were from all corners of the city. We had a really great map of the whole city with the BRT corridors on it right when you came into the sessions, and we gave everyone a sticker that said, where do you live, where do you work, where do you go to school? And it was really great over the course of those 9 sessions to see dots all over the city and many dots in the areas of those corridors and focusing on some of those areas. So it was really, it was kind of a fun project to have throughout each of those 9 sessions. And so the feedback that we received from those sessions, combined with our technical design and evaluation criteria, is what we're using to help determine our preferred design option. So for the most part, a lot of the comments and questions that we saw focused largely around the rationale of the project. You know, a lot of people were saying, why are we doing this and what does it mean for me? And that was, again, it was a really good opportunity for us to be able to speak one-on-one and as a group with many Londoners and help demystify some of those misconceptions about the project, to help dispel, or I guess get out some of the great messaging that we have about the benefits for London, for all Londoners, not just those that necessarily live along the corridors. Some of the input that we received was specific on the design alignments and the different options. And so again, we've pooled those comments into our evaluation that we're working on to present a preferred option. Some of the top questions that we heard and were able to answer for the public were things like how local service will integrate with BRT to improve local service citywide. We were able to explain to people who asked how dedicated transit lanes will improve emergency service response times, as well as snow removal operations. We answered questions about how bike lanes will integrate with rapid transit, explained to people that may be impacted potentially by property impacts, how that property negotiation process works. We also were able to clarify for many people what our construction timelines are, so people could get an understanding of, you know, this is a big project, when can they expect us to be coming through their neighborhood? We talked about how we're mitigating the impacts of our CPR crossings, and we're also talking about the trees and some of the ways that we're working to be able to improve the streetscape as we go through with this project. So what's next for the project? Our team, I guess, is now working to refine our design concepts based on our feedback and our technical criteria. And so we'll be ready to present that recommended design later this month. We'll be hosting a series of open houses from February 28th to March 3rd to help give Londoners a chance to preview those designs in advance of us bringing them forward to council. We are planning to bring the full information along with our draft environmental project report forward to council in April. So this gives everybody a bit of about an extra month's worth of time to sort of wrap their heads around the designs, ask questions at those sessions, and help understand what it is that we'll be bringing forward for council to consider in the beginning of April. Once council approves our draft EPR that we bring forward, then that is where we trigger the beginning of the formal TPAP consultation process. So we also want to stress to the public that there's further consultation still to come. So the draft EPR will present our preliminary design option. It'll go through an additional 6 months of formal consultation with additional public information centers, where again, the public will be able to come out, and this time, rather than commenting on the different options, provide their feedback on that preferred design so we can refine that to come up with the best system that we can for our city. And so that concludes the project update. Just a quick run through, because I wanted to give us as much time as we can with our guests from across the country in the US. So on that note, as I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate to have our panel of transit experts. And we're going to have them talk to us today about some of their experiences. We were able to spend the day with them learning about what's worked in their cities and their challenges, and we actually went through our current concepts for the design and our different options that we've been working through, pretty much kilometer by kilometer, and kind of talk through some of those different areas where we want to say, is there something that you see here that maybe you do differently, or you've seen done in other places and it worked really well, or maybe it saw challenges. So that was really great to literally walk through the full corridor and kind of get their input on our designs as they are today. We also went back and just at a high level reviewed some of the design criteria that we use as our base foundation to evaluate the project going forward. And we talked about some of those other, I guess, some of the other, not frill, but the other design elements that'll help make this a really amenable feature for our city. So accessibility, integration of cyclists, utility management, curbside activities, streets and streetscapes, the stops. And so again, we talked through some of those issues and got some ideas again, what's been done in other municipalities. So I just want to take a quick opportunity to introduce our panel. We have Paul May from York Region Transit Commission, and he's the chief engineer on that project. Bjorn Radstrom from Winnipeg Transit, he's the manager of their service development. Wilson Tavera from Metrolinx, he's a project manager for BRT. And Jack Gonzalez, who is with WSP USA Inc., and he's a project manager for BRT and transit projects across the US and Canada. So after a brief presentation, Brian Hollingworth from IBI is going to give us sort of an overview of some of those key points that we talked about today, and then he's going to facilitate a discussion and allow the group to be able to answer questions. So thank you.
Jenny, just before you get started, Mr. Hollingworth, can we just take care of some of the housekeeping things? Then we have a good block of time for our guests today. Does anyone have any objection to that? Councillor Squire?
Yeah, I just wondered if we're going to be able to ask Ms. Ramsey or Ms. Scheer some questions at some point about the public process, because I do have a question for my constituents.
I have no issues with that. Does anyone else on the group? No? You're prepared for any questions today? Great. Okay. Okay, so we'll just move ahead to the consent items. We have 2, and unless anyone has any issues or concerns, I'd like to move them both together. Just need a mover and a seconder on that, please. Mayor and Councillor Helmer, all in favor? Thank you. And we'll move on to the items for discussion, the brief to implementation working group from Mr. Brock. I'd just like to move this as a note and file. These issues can and have been brought up with the rapid transit team, and I don't think it's really our place to debate those. So Mayor Brown, seconder, Councillor Helmer, all in favor? Thank you. And we'll just do the deferred matters. This is just a note and file as well, especially for the commissioners who may not know that Councillor Armstrong has resigned from the working group. Okay. Mover and a seconder, Councillor Helmer, Councillor Van Holst, all in favor? Thank you. And we'll cover the 2 items for discussion. The pilot high occupancy vehicles lane, as well as the proactive planting replacement trees. And these are Councillor Van Holst's submissions, so I'm going to let him take the floor on those.
Okay, thank you very much. Why don't I just start with the easier one, the trees. So recently we had a bunch of trees wrapped with caution tape along the corridor. People are concerned about trees being cut down. And wondering about getting ahead of that, if that's going to be the case, and we're going to eventually be putting trees in afterwards. I was thinking about the park on Wellington Road by the curve. If we're planting more trees, can we do those earlier on so that when the project happens and trees are cut down, it won't be that noticeable because we've got trees already there that have had a number of years to mature.
Through the chair, I think that as we move forward, we understand that tree impacts are somewhat unavoidable with any construction project, whether it's a BRT project or a sewer project. But what we do try to do is always enhance and target at least a 3-to-1 replacement ratio for trees. We also try to leave the streetscape better than the way we found it when we come out of there. And so we recognize that replacement trees don't necessarily all need to go along the corridors. I think advancing early planting of trees along the actual routes themselves, where we're going to be potentially in construction zones, may not be amenable to try. They'll probably just be damaged again, but there may be opportunities, as you suggested, in park areas or other spots, maybe not even along the corridors, where as a city in line with our urban forestry strategy, we look for opportunities to plant trees and increase our overall canopy.
Okay, thank you. And the next one, the pilot there. Reason I brought this one up, but this is an issue that came up in one of the public participation meetings. Somebody suggested this. When we're doing our modeling, there's a lot of assumptions being made. And I'm sure there's some ways to test those assumptions and get some data to help inform our decisions. So, for instance, an HOV lane is a way of partially closing a lane as opposed to completely closing a lane. So if we did that, we'd be able to find out what some of the impacts are. So are there ways to test some of our assumptions? Can we do things to see what the impacts are going to be and be sure that our assumptions are correct? Because there are many of them, I understand.
Through the chair, I think it's very difficult to be able to do a trial run that can replicate what the conditions would be going forward. So some of the things that our modeling looked at, particularly in the north end where we did our enhanced modeling to review what the impacts of our proposed BRT options along, say, Richmond North was, is that we looked at all the impacts. We looked at the improvements being made on Western Warncliffe Road to take away that bottleneck where the rail crossing is, the Adelaide grade separation, the fact that Western is planning to move to a car-free campus, which would remove traffic that's coming through campus from Sarnia over. And so taking all those different factors into account, and then as well the improvements that we'll be making to Richmond Road to include left turn, right turn facilities and bus bays, all those different factors come together to be able to create the conditions that we'll have ultimately. And that's not something that we're able to pilot or dry run under current conditions. And that's why we use the modeling that we do to be able to anticipate and look at the impacts of all those different impacts and factors combined.
Okay, thank you. So do you see in the rollout those all happening at the same time then? Because that's what would be required. I mean, so for it to work the way the modeling would suggest.
I think our plan and how we're staging our project is to be able to allow for some of those parallel improvements to be happening ahead of us moving forward with the north leg, and for using that particular example. But some things that we are planning for are elements that we can bring forward through our Quick Start program, which might include some priority, the slip lanes and some priority signals, maybe using express lanes to kind of replicate some of the ways that a BRT system might work to start building some of that excitement. But in terms of replicating the impacts of changing the lane configurations, that's difficult to provide real time.
Okay, thank you very much then. It'll be interesting to see what the plan for staging. I think that will be significant to the residents as well in order to build confidence that things won't get gridlocked. That's probably the most concerning area, the Richmond Street North that you were referring to.
Does anyone have any input on these two questions? No? Okay, can I have a mover and a seconder just to receive this? Mayor Brown and Councillor Van Holst, all in favor? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to, I just want to cover Councillor Squire's questions for Ms. Ramsey and Ms. Scheer. So if you want to, you ready?
The reason I'm asking this question is because I sent an email to earlier and I didn't receive an answer to this, so I felt the only way I could ask it on behalf of my constituents was to do it publicly. Otherwise, I did raise it offline, so I want to be clear on that. Some of my constituents have raised concerns about where the line between staff relaying technical aspects of the project stops and advocacy from staff begins. And there was particular concerns expressed to me by my constituents because I don't read or follow media. I don't like it to influence my decision. There is a number of concerns about op-ed pieces being written by staff, which they felt they would like to join issue with and they didn't agree with. So I'm just wondering, and I'd like Ms. Scheer if she can answer it, where does that line start and where does it stop so that I can tell my constituents between staff doing their job and expressing an opinion?
Thank you, through the chair. I know certainly that when staff express an opinion through an op-ed that we do try our best to stick to the facts as we have presented them in the business case and in our other communications in front of committee and council. We certainly try not to stray from what we have as orders and direction from council with respect to moving a project forward, but that can be an area where people may see that it is a bit gray. I appreciate the feedback that you've provided us, and we certainly do take our role with the media quite seriously. In terms of a hard line, in terms of staff not writing op-eds, we do believe that there is a a role for the administration to provide a counterpoint to some of the op-eds that are provided that particularly don't share factual information. But we do try to stick, as I said, to the facts as we understand them from the business case.
Do we have any further questions for Ms. Scherer or Ms. Ramsey? Okay, I'd just like to make one point to the presentation that you did as well. I really appreciated having all the questions that people asked at the information centers. What I would like to see are the answers to those two, because not everyone's going to be watching this and not everyone's going to take the time to follow up on all those answers. And I know that we have them and I know they're readily available, but if we could just take out or add that one step, that would be terrific. Thank you very much. So I guess we'll move into our expert peer review panel. And Mr. Hollingworth, if you could do the introductions, please.
My name is Brian Hollingworth. I'm the Consultant Project Manager for London's Rapid Transit Project. My presentation here tonight, which I will ask to be put on the screen, is really just introducing the topic of today, the BRT expert panel. So Ms. Ramsey already introduced our expert panel, but I'll just elaborate a little bit more for reminders. We have 4 individuals with us today, and we're fortunate to have a great cross-section of people with design experience, transit implementation experience, even in contract administration type roles, starting with Paul May from York Rapid Transit Corporation. And Paul, I can attest, has seen it from early days. He's been involved with the Viva project since its conception through to dealing with daily construction matters as recent as today. For a $1.7 billion project. Wilson Taveria is from Metrolinx and has 15 years of experience, largely in the engineering and design, and was very useful when it came to some of the design aspects of reviewing London's projects. And he has worked throughout the GTA on a variety of different transit projects. Bjorn Radstrom is from Winnipeg, and Bjorn wears a few hats. One is more on the transit service planning side, but also as the project manager for planning and preliminary design of Winnipeg's Southwest Transitway, which was the largest project that infrastructure project that Winnipeg has ever done. And Jack Gonzalez. Jack is from Parsons Brinkerhoff and responsible for PB's corporate BRT initiatives, and again spans from design to implementation, even a lot on multimodal aspects of different projects. And he has worked on projects from Seattle, Portland, Denver, Salt Lake City, Vancouver, San Antonio, and Las Vegas. So a wealth of experience with our expert panel. What did we discuss today? We discussed the design criteria used for the project. These were established early on. I think this group has seen some of those that are presented in the master plan, but it was good to just have another review of those criteria, everything from lane widths to the positioning of utilities. We discussed the BRT corridor designs, and that was really the bulk of our session with these experts working through north, south, east, west, downtown, hands-on review of the corridor designs and alternatives. We discussed to some extent on the BRT stop design and some of the elements of size, spacing, length, making sure that we had everything incorporated. We discussed local transit integration at the high level, but also when it came to some of the designs and concepts that were presented. We discussed construction and phasing, and I'll talk about that briefly, and operations and maintenance. And I'm not going to go into great details about everything we discussed today. It was a long session and a lot of great details. I'm going to let you have your chance to ask the experts things that are on your mind. But just briefly, some of the key things that I took away from the meeting. Stand your ground on exclusive lanes. I think one of our experts, the quote was, exclusive lanes are king, critical to the success of the network. BRT median lanes are preferable to curbside running, and I'll let you probe our experts on some of their thoughts if you so choose. They gave us good advice on pedestrian amenities and the whole notion that this just isn't about the transit, it's about the entire environment around the stations and the running ways. We had a lot of, advice on where you might compromise design, where you hit some challenging areas. And I think the overwhelming message was, at the stage we're at, continue to focus on the core values of BRT was one of the quotes. And there is a recognition that this is always challenging designing in urban areas, but if we start, scaling back and compromising early on, it's not the best way to go. Finally, considering intuitive designs to minimize confusion for transit passengers and other road users, and that relates to signage, wayfinding, right down to pavement markings and the design of intersections. And they even, talked about bus drivers, needing to make it easy for bus drivers. We think they're experts, but they have to do it every day. In terms of the design and operations, again, this came up several times that dedicated lanes are, no surprise, the best way to ensure reliable transit service. But they're also important for reducing conflicts. They tend to improve safety, and the understandability of the system is pretty key. The environmental assessment should plan for the ultimate corridor design, and I touched on this briefly, but looking at protecting for, in some cases, some unknowns, as opposed to scaling back too early. The experts also talked a little bit about education campaigns, signs and wayfinding, as I mentioned, and just making it a high-quality system. So I won't dwell on things too much. We'll just round it out by talking about next steps in implementation. Our experts recognize, as we do, that designs will evolve. We're at a stage now, sort of moving from concept to a preliminary engineering design, and those designs will continue to evolve right to opening day. They stressed the importance of risk assessment, especially when it comes to things like contamination and utilities, and the need to get a good handle on some of the high-risk areas early on. And finally, we talked about implementation and phasing, and this was already raised and got different advice from our expert panels. Some folks said, implement it on the highest ridership corridor first. That's your best bang for your buck. Others recognize that in some cases, things like other construction projects and ease of implementation also factored into some of their decisions on implementation. So that's the highlights of the expert panel, and I was referred to as a facilitator. I'm not sure how that works with a group of this significance, but I think the intent is that questions will be sort of directed through me, and I'll maybe point to each of the experts, knowing their areas of expertise, and go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. So I think we'll start at the end with Councillor Squire, and we'll do 2 questions per person. And then once we get through, we'll come back around, okay? Councillor Squire?
First of all, I think I should tell you before we start that I represent an area that's going to be heavily impacted by BRT. And it's an area where there's a huge difference of opinion within that area about whether BRT is a good thing or a bad thing. I also have a high rate of involvement of my constituents in the public participation process, and anyone here will tell you they are vocal, they are organized, and they expect their voices to be heard. So that being said, I'm interested in the 2 things that were said, which seem to me to be a little bit contradictory. Don't compromise early on the design, which my constituents would not be happy to hear. And the second is be prepared for the design to evolve, which they would be very happy about. So they live in an area that they're very invested in, and they expect that as the process evolves, that their voices will be heard. that their preference as to the design of the particular route or corridor, they will have influence on that based on their knowledge of the area. So I just wonder, from your experience, is my first question, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with an area that's deeply divided on this issue, and a politician who's supposed to represent that area with all its diverse interests, and make sure that public input is heard during the process?
Through the chair, and I'll take my direction from you, Ms. Ruth, on how we want to just go directly to the participants or not. But I'll start with Paul, who may have influenced some of that comment and has a lot of experience on the design process.
Thank you, Brian, and through you, Madam Chair, thanks for the question. Yeah, there's always going to be a mix of opinion on these projects and the benefit of them or the disbenefit of them, and those that are most negatively impacted are certainly the ones that are most vocal at the beginning. The ones that benefit from it tend to not be as vocal. Even though they're supporters, they don't come out to any large extent to your public meeting and to cheer you on. It's the ones that are impacted. In terms of impact on each of those individual property owners or adjacent business owners, it's impossible for the team at this stage of the process to know exactly how much that impact is going to be. They can't define, they've got a rough idea of how much property they need, but not an exact idea. So that's where there needs to be some flexibility during the design process to try and minimize that impact. They can try and tighten it as much as possible and define exactly what they need. And then also to determine together with the property owner, how does the project integrate together with the remaining part of their property. So if you have a parking lot, for example, that is impacted, if you need a little bit of property from a plaza with a parking lot, you may not know exactly how many spaces are going to be impacted or how to reconfigure that parking lot to make maximum use of what's available. So it's that part of the detailed design process where there has to be a lot of communication, a lot of consultation with those individuals to figure out exactly where their impact is. And then throughout the project, communication is absolutely key, essential. You can never communicate too much. We have dedicated communication staff. We have dedicated community liaisons. And those community liaisons, their job is to get familiar with every owner, every business owner, every tenant, every resident in the corridor, so that any issues that evolve or that come up during construction or during design, they're the go-to person, they're the one point of contact to get their issue resolved.
Jack, I think you had some thoughts on your experience across the U.S. with multiple projects where they started with different levels of implementation.
To the working group and to Councillor Squire. So don't compromise early is, unfortunately, bus rapid transit is considered a flexible type of transit mode, and flexibility is its greatest attribute and its worst enemy at the same time, because unlike light rail or streetcar where it runs on a dedicated rail track, a lot of folks will talk about, well, BRT is so flexible it can actually get out of the get out of an exclusive lane and be in a mixed traffic lane. And in particular, the areas that they have that conversation is the choke points where there's limited right of way or highly congested intersections. Unfortunately, that's exactly where you need to build an exclusive right of way to bypass that congestion to create reliability and travel time savings. So in many cases, I've seen a very, sometimes maybe a timid approach to say, well, we don't want to upset anybody because it's our first BRT line and it's the hardest time to put in a BRT line, it's your first one, but you want that one to be a success so you can build other ones off that strength. And so that's why the comment of don't compromise too early, because when you end up compromising and being flexible and put BRT in mixed traffic lines in lanes like that, you end up with a bundle of compromise at the end of the project, and you wish you wouldn't do this. And many clients have implemented BRT systems, their first one, and looked back and said, I wish I would have bought that extra sliver of right-of-way to get that station. I wish I would have put a bypass lane through there. Now that I'm having a problem as congestion grows and traffic grows of getting the reliability I need from there. But their second and third BRT lines, they learn and say, let's make sure we ask for what we want to. Yes, as we advance the design, there'll be adjustments. There'll be design variations that do get through those choke points, and a variety of tricks or strategies that you can apply. So I think that was more to the point, that try to focus on the exclusive guideway as much as you can, and yes, and bend, but don't break on those choke point areas, because they become really issues for liability. I hope I answered that question.
Did you have a follow-up question?
I think you've, just to comment, you just said, did you answer? You've reinforced what I already know. You've reinforced, and I hope my constituents heard it. My second question is this, moving beyond design and building this system, the one thing I constantly raise everywhere I am is, what's it gonna cost to operate this system? And one of the aspects of that, if you have some assistance to provide me, it would be great. If you, and I'm not looking for guesstimates or ideas or concepts, but I want to know how a BRT system affects the ridership of the transit system, because I've read a lot of material. I've read about the effects of ride sharing on public transit in the United States of America, the downward pressure that it's provided there. And our business case is based on an assumption about increased ridership. So what I'm looking for is what your experience is after your system is in place as to ridership. Does it increase ridership? Does ridership stay the same? What does it do? And I would prefer that if you have numbers, that's great. That's sort of what I'm looking for. If you don't have numbers, then that's fine too.
I'm not going to direct a question to anyone, so as not to be biased.
I'll chime in there quickly. I actually emailed a colleague of mine today because we do have some statistics from two of the corridors that we opened up first in York Region, one in Newmarket and one in Markham. Ridership in Markham is up 10%, ridership in Newmarket is up 62%. So for hard numbers, I don't know if that's appealing to you or not, but in terms of, so that's ridership. In terms of travel time savings, we're about 30% or more savings in both of those corridors. So those are the first two quarters that we've opened in York Region. We've recently opened one in Vaughan. We don't have statistics yet because that's so new, but we'd be willing to share those as they come along over time.
Just to follow up, I've heard those numbers, but I was looking for system-wide numbers. Do you have system-wide numbers on your system as a whole, how it's affected by bus rapid transit?
I don't personally know. Probably attainable from York Rapid Transit themselves, York Region Transit. They may have something because they probably do a lot of statistics on that stuff, but not personally.
Councilor Park? Oh.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add to that last response that keep in mind also that our bus rapid transit network is not complete. We've opened up several corridors, but we're only about half done, and the other half is still under construction. So we see more benefit happening when the whole network is done. And then, you know, so if you ask me in several years' time, I might have a more complete answer for you.
In Winnipeg, we saw, after the first couple of years after our first section of BRT opened, and keep in mind, this is just 1/3 of one corridor that we built. It's the first leg of our southwest corridor. We saw about a 10% increase, and we've seen growth on this corridor faster than the rest of the system. One thing that I want to make sure that we don't lose in this discussion about ridership increases and improved travel times is the improvement in reliability. That, in my mind, that's almost the most important thing with it. If you were to assume that RT stands for reliable transit instead of rapid transit, it's not exactly the easiest sell. It doesn't quite attract people like saying rapid transit. But people can accept not a huge increase or not a huge improvement in travel times if they know that their trip that takes 20 minutes, scheduled to take 20 minutes, always takes 20 minutes, and they'll always be able to make their transfer because they're not affected by all the other congestion that's happening. So my view is that reliability is the one thing that gets lost in the debate, and it's the most important thing.
One more, yep.
First of all, in the reading of the names, what municipality are you from? Oh, sorry.
Winnipeg.
Thank you very much. You must have warmed up when you came to London. The last thing you said, I'm really glad that you said that. We had public meetings at the Budweiser Gardens, and when we got through all the people who were really mad, the people at the end who use transit regularly said, it's not so much travel time, it's knowing that when I'm standing at that bus stop, if I'm a young woman standing there late at night, that bus is going to show up when you say it's going to show up. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that point, and I think you're spot on when you say that.
To add to the ridership, in states, we do, or ridership models are similar here, we're projecting a 20-year horizon typically. And those forecasts seem like they're pretty large, you know, from initial opening day to the 20-year horizon to 2034. But in Los Angeles, the Orange Line opened up. In Eugene, Oregon, in Seattle, King County Metro, anywhere from 1 to 5 year time frames, we've met those projections to 20-year horizons. So I can speak to that. I don't have statistics as far as percentage increase, but in the less than 1 to 5 year range, those have already been hit. As a matter of fact, in LA, the Orange Line is now to a point we're looking at conversion to light rail because we're at 22, 23,000, 18,000 riders per weekday.
Councillor Park.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, I believe, well, I recognize it's a panel, but I'm going to pinpoint my question to one person. To Mr. Radstrom from Winnipeg, thanks for blowing into town. My sister's actually there, and I hope you can find her. So anyway, I know where she is.
Oh.
Okay, let's just lay that down. Anyway, so when we're dealing with a big project, rapid transit, whether it's light rail or BRT, a municipality has to do a gut check and also an identity check. So I'm just curious how Winnipeg waded through all of those things, recognizing that Winnipeg has a river, just like we do, narrow corridors and heritage conservation districts, like we do. So there's a lot of parallels here, and I'd really like to hear a little bit more about the journey from your perspective, and also if you can pinpoint me to any articles throughout how neighborhoods adjusted to all these things.
Sure. We started, this is actually before I joined Winnipeg Transit, so probably somewhere around 2005, we started something called the On-Street Transit Improvement Program. Leave it to engineers to think of a really catchy name for a program like that. And what it did was we went through every single corridor in the city and tried to figure out ways that we could implement transit priority measures, things like transit priority signals, queue jump lanes, and things like that to squeeze as much efficiency as we could out of the system. And that took about, from implementation till it was done, was 2006 through 2009. And at that point, we realized that if we wanted to see any other improvements to the system, we had to be focusing on a rapid transit plan, as opposed to just trying to do spot improvements here and there. And there was a fair bit of public engagement involved in this on-street transit improvement program. And then in about 2008 is when we started doing an update to our city master plan and then an update to our transportation master plan. And in those, we acknowledged that we'd been spending a lot of time and effort squeezing these little bits of efficiencies out of the system, and it was very successful. We improved performance on a lot of different corridors, but you get to the point where you just can't squeeze any more efficiency out of it, and that's where, through all the public engagement we did with the update to the city master plan and then the transportation master plan, we got buy-in with city council and with the public that rapid transit was the next logical step in improving our system. There wasn't much more that we could do otherwise.
Commissioner Shepherd.
That's okay. Thanks very much. I realize I'm asking a panel of transit experts, but I'm going to try to ask you a non-transit question. There are a lot of benefits to a rapid transit project like this, and people are naturally very focused on well, is it really going to increase my ride or shorten my ride time? Some very kind of natural human narrow focuses. I'm wondering from your experience, if you can, or from what you know of our plan, or from other with, what is perhaps one of the top one or two other non-transit benefits that we should be talking about when we're talking about also, we're going to bring you a lot of great new transit. What else? Is there something that stood out in other situations that come hand in hand that people might latch on to and see this project?
Paul might be best to start out with that because he started from an area which wasn't familiar with rapid transit back in the day and seeing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple there that I think it's an important part of the growth plan for York Region, these rapid transit corridors, that it supports our centers and corridors plan. Rapid transit runs through each of the 4 regional centers identified in York Region, and the development is following where the transit is going through the combination of planning policies as well as the presence of rapid transit. So, you know, we've actually had discussions with condo builders and developers saying they're following our project along, buying up property, you know, old industrial property and converting it to high-rise residential. So it's a key and integral part of the growth plan for York Region because our overall urban boundary is constrained and we're still growing very rapidly. And then talking about a completely different benefit, non-transit related, is we've seen in the corridors that we've completed a drop in regular traffic accidents at those intersections. We're not sure the reasons why. I think part of it is just that it's a different driving environment. So if York Region's very much a suburban area, wide arterial roads, people drive well over the speed limit. By implementing the bus rapid transit with the center median transit, even though it's still a wide right-of-way, there's more visual cues there to help you slow down. And so traffic is slowing down. They're paying more attention at intersections, and that pays off, I think, in a reduction in vehicle accidents.
I think an important thing is that it can help you avoid having to invest in widening roads and creating grade separations of different major roads. You've only got a finite pot of money that you're going to spend on transportation improvements. If you're investing it in transit, you help to avoid basically road expansion projects.
Thanks. On a completely different note, I'll go back to the slide where you showed some of your topics of discussion today and some of your recommendations, specifically related to the importance of pedestrian amenities. So I'd really like to hear a little bit of detail or example from you, please, about what kind of pedestrian amenities have you found powerful in your experience?
Do you want to take that one, Jack?
Well, as part of the project, some of the ancillary improvements are, you know, pedestrian multi-use trails. And so biking is encouraged. In many cases, active transportation with biking and walking is inherently increased because people could access a BRT a little more achievable with BRTs. Sort of transit mode, and it's particularly strengthened when it's in a center running way where it's more across the go ahead, since more of that.
The width of the sidewalk. There's a cost that goes.
We are doing this project for many, many, many reasons. If you talk to
We had several different opinions on that question from this group that came up today, and
Just anything in a local area, dry cleaning, restaurants, where you live in that zone. And again, with the throughput, I think I talked about mode shift, where we're trying to encourage riders and choice riders if you put the improvements in, you're willing to.
Recently just the TTC subway extension there has something to do with that, but, you know, usually with transit, it's you're building it after the fact, you're catching up with, you know, trying to relieve congestion and whatnot. This is more of a case of build it and they will come.
and my next question is about the 80-20 rule. So 20% of our residents are projected to be riding the transit, but we think that another 80% are going to be driving cars at the end of this process. So how do you make sure that it's not worse for the 80% who are still driving around?
Paul might have some thoughts and stats on traffic signal optimization and things like that, or whatever.
York Region's a little bit different from the City of London in that we are a more suburban area. So we we do have wider right-of-ways, and so in implementing our projects, we haven't had any sections where we've taken away lanes and converted them to BRT. In each case, whatever the existing general purpose lanes were, whether it was 2 or 3 lanes on those arterial roads, we've replicated them by widening the road and implementing our BRT in the middle. In London, you know, you're a lot more constrained, particularly in your downtown area. So we don't have a similar downtown area in York. A lot of concern that we mid-block, you know, we're not allowing left turns anymore. It's only the right in, right out, and left turns plus U-turns, and none of that has happened. Traffic finds its way to the best, most efficient route for their individual journey. And there's always a period of adjustment after you implement the project. And so for most of our projects, you know, there's been no disbenefit at all to traffic. And in some cases, there's actually been an improvement for regular traffic.
I might add just for a bit, for the 80% that are will be driving, I'm sure you're aware of what's so-called signal prior. Or T can flow through that intersection. It might hold that green 3 or 4 seconds longer, and so improves traffic flow for its BRT corridor, but the cars adjacent to you or driving the same direction feel that benefit also, because they're going through that green light too. So it makes all traffic flow easier through that corridor. Now, I'm not measuring this, but there is a modest benefit to all cars like that. Thank you.
Okay, Nick, thank you. Follow up, because you talked about a situation you didn't have to take property to expand a lane. I'm sure you had to look at probably what was our biggest challenges on Richmond Street, where we've got 2 lanes or 2 lanes in either direction, and one of our plans is to leave it like that, hoping that there'll be a big decrease in demand for that, or we'll have to take a substantial amount of property to expand that. Looking at that, did you have any advice? Is it go big or go home? Easy does it? What just intuitively, what did you think about that challenge?
To buy a lot of property to achieve what we've built. So if I led you astray there, I apologize. What I meant was we're starting with a wider right-of-way. Lanes in the middle. Sorry, and then the second part of your question was.
So are we generally better off expanding, or should we try to go? Should we try to make it work by taking should we take the traffic lanes, or we should try to expand and have the bus lanes in addition?
I don't think I can advise you on that. I haven't done the detailed traffic studies or familiar enough with the road network and current levels of congestion in London to be able to advise you on whether you should do that or not. If you've got parallel routes that drivers can easily divert to, then maybe you don't need to. If there's no other road option for people to get from one point to another aside from that road, then maybe you do want to widen that road. So it's very location specific, I think, and I'm just not familiar enough with London to be able to say, yes, do that, or no, don't do that.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, as you might imagine, colleagues, but I'm going to try and focus them in. So perhaps for Paul, especially in your previous role, one of the risks that has come up all the time, I've had the opportunity to go and visit a lot of rapid transit projects, some of which were under construction all over the country. And one thing that is very clearly communicated by the staff who work on it is make sure you get your utilities, relocations, and everything sorted in advance of building the project. This is the big cause of delays and where a lot of friction can happen. And I wonder what kind of advice you might have for us in trying to do as much as we can to avoid those kind of delays and issues that might come up, and to what extent you've discussed it with the panel and our staff.
I think all of our panel members have been through that, and I think all of them raised it. But Paul, maybe you're living and breathing it, so.
Yeah, certainly. We did talk about it today, and then even after the session was finished, I had an informal further discussion with some of London staff specifically on that issue. And yeah, it is the number one risk that we have in our projects. And to a certain extent, it depends on the type of contracting method you use to build the project. So in a traditional design and then go out for tender and then build the project, there's a period of time in there before you go out to tender the project where you do the utility relocations. And so then you don't face that risk of delay to the contract, but it extends the total amount of time of construction on that corridor because you're separating out the utilities, doing them first, then tendering, then building all of the road widening. So overall, it'll take you a longer period of time. The other risk that you face when you do that is that then you're taking all the risk that you've put the new utilities in the right location and for the ultimate, to accommodate the ultimate design. And if you haven't, that can cause you a lot of changes and delay with your contractor. So we've spent a lot of time working out those processes with each of our utilities, and then embedding specific language into our contracts. And all of our contracts have been a design build type of contract where we're hiring both the designers and the contractor at the same time. So they have to advance the design sufficiently to do the utility relocations and then coordinate all of that work together with their own construction schedules. And we've learned an enormous amount of lessons from one contract to another, that we keep improving our methods and our processes and the language in our contracts. So by the time we've gotten to our fifth contract, I think it's working pretty well. But back in the first one or two contracts, it wasn't working well, and we did face delays that did eat up a lot of our contingency, and we did have a lot of delay costs.
I am interested in hearing from anybody else on this one. This is a pretty important one, so go ahead.
So, yes, utilities can be not only a schedule buster, but a budget buster if you're not tracking it early enough. And so as a two-step process, the philosophy we try to use is, unlike light rail or streetcar or bus rapid transit, we try to use a philosophy of protect in place as much as possible. In other words, if you have to move the utility, it can be moved. If the utility owner is okay with you building a road over the utility, which with some sort of IGA or access later on, that's fine too, and it actually helps save time and budget. But the first step is to figure out allowable contingencies and what that utility might cost, and put that into your budget very early and track that. And constant communication with utilities if they have prior rights, then it's gonna cost you as the project to move it if you need it moved. If they don't have prior rights, you work out an arrangement, or hopefully work out an arrangement where you may not have to move it, or just move it around your station. That's a very expensive thing. So it's up to them to decide how they want to access it, or how you want to be inconvenienced later on, or the potential that it may never have an issue, frankly. In many cases, I've used casings underneath stations that may or may never be used, but it's very cheap insurance to put the casing in if they want to use it, or have them just relocate it for themselves as a project cost. So there's a variety of strategies to use, but the first step is to bracket the cost with an allocated contingency that's worthwhile, that you really know you can use, and then try to design around it if you can.
I would say that you need to get the utilities involved right at the beginning, even when you're doing conceptual designs. A lot of times you might think that you understand what their plans are based on what they put out in public documents, but there's little details that you don't even realize. An example of that might be that there's a hydro line somewhere, and you think, okay, it's there, and that's where it's going to be. Even if they have plans to replace it, you know, it's going to stay there. But then you find out that that's a very critical line, and when they replace that, they actually have to construct the new one next to it, connect it first, and then decommission the old one. Well, that might eat up 3-4 meters of the right-of-way that you thought you were going to use. And it's just through casual meetings that you have when you're just reviewing these designs that you find out about these things. And that happens with every utility, but especially the hydro ones. That seems to be the expensive one, and with the railways as well. So getting them in right at the beginning, just even when you're spitballing some ideas, it's hugely helpful.
I'll just add one more thing quickly. Some of our projects, we've done a lot of subsurface utility exploration in advance during conceptual design. If you include that in the PSOS with the contractor, and they can get ahead of where things actually are and advance the discussions with the utilities early, it goes a long way. I think that's it.
Thank you, and really helpful to hear that. And one of the reasons I'm glad to hear that kind of feedback is this is the kind of stuff that we've been hearing from our team all the way along in the project planning. So I'm glad to hear that it's very consistent. You know, it's one of these risks that you always got to keep in mind, and it's difficult to manage, but it seems like we're doing all the right things on that front. So I'm glad to hear that. I had a question for perhaps Jack. It's coming from one of our colleagues on council, Councillor Turner. He couldn't be here today, but he wanted to ask. And so he's wondering, you've worked in a lot of different US cities. What kind of sort of soft marketing type strategies have you seen transit agencies roll out in support of new rapid transit lines that have been successful in driving ridership?
Well, first I'll start off with plagiarism is good. Okay, so you use what's used in other cities and their lessons learned. Frankly, it used to be that video simulations were very expensive to develop, and now the cost has come way down. So I would say visualizations or even animations as video, a generalized cost, and a list of benefits, not only just for the traveling or the transit riders, but anybody that's ancillary would be helpful. And we used to, I think we made a mistake in Eugene where we just showed this, we did this animation just to show to the federal government, FTA, to sort of get funding. And it turns out that it caught kind of a viral thing where developers looked at it, and then the city's economic department looked at it because they were trying to lure in companies and so forth. So we didn't really advertise it that much, but we should have, because as it turned out, developers like that sort of thing, because now they can sort of strategize where to look at putting in buildings or developments near a station. And added to that, the city economic development can talk about maybe ways to relax some of the auto space parking or floor area averages, you know, so you maybe rise up 2 stories instead of, you know, city codes that could be relaxed around stationary planning. So this is kind of marketing that all starts with this animated video and some just general concepts to kind of create the energy. In addition to that, they include a lot of stakeholders that are from the communities. You know, every station or where they think about a station, they go out and entice the community to ask questions and let them identify their community, their neighborhood, and even to the point we might do a station design competition and have that input, because the funny thing is that even though I like the whole reliability and speed savings and everything, it's the stations that are really the energy that people get excited about and what those amenities look like, because that's what they're on most of the time. So we found that having that early dialogue creates that idea, and then along comes the travel time savings and all electric vehicles and conversations about real-time information and snow melt and heated, and you don't have to get in your car, and how fast you can travel from point B. So that's my experience in Ben, and I'm sure there's other marketing standards employees also, but
Commissioner Southern, do you want something?
Thank you. This one's for Paul, I think. You mentioned community liaisons, and it's felt to me, and I don't know if anybody else has felt this, that we've had a lot of misinformation out in the community about the whole project in general. And I was wondering if, like, how'd your community liaison project, like, aspect of your project work, and do you think it would be applicable to the way we're running things now, or did it start later in your system, or do we already have something comparable here?
Well, the community liaisons are really critical as you get into the actual construction. And so then they're the point person for every piece of disruption that happens along your construction. So they're the ones that are distributing all the information to the adjacent and affected property owners and business owners, tenants in the corridor to say, you know, we need to put a water main through your driveway, so we need to close it, you know, on the at this time, or what's the most convenient time to impact your driveway? Is it at nighttime? Is it during certain hours? You know, working out those kind of logistics with each of the adjacent owners. They're also critical when an incident happens. So for example, when you hit a utility and you will accidentally hit utilities, you'll cut phone lines or cable lines, or you'll cut power or affect the water line. They're the point person that then mitigates the impact on those business owners. So if we hit a water line, they're actually delivering cases of water if you need them to business owners, or passing on the information about how the repairs are going and when they can expect their water to be turned back on, that sort of thing. At this stage of the project, it's not quite as important as the overall communications, right? You're communicating to a much broader audience. By the time you're at construction, you're communicating more heavily, but to a narrower audience, just right in the corridor. So I don't know if that answers your question, or?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that they were more like community champions, like somebody out there kind of not cheering on everything, but making sure everybody has the story straight. So I didn't really realize they're there to mitigate more than educate, but that's cool. And my next question is kind of to everybody, and I'm just wondering, how often have you run into choke points in your BRTs, like you said, going into mixed traffic as we are on Warncliffe, or having a train that goes across like we are on Richmond? And how best did you mitigate those, just broadly, not exact details? And is there anything that any of those issues you would have done differently in advance that we could know about? Thank you.
Winnipeg has lots of trains.
Yeah, but the rapid transit corridors don't really cross them at grade. Yeah, we, in all cases with the railways, we either went over or under. So those were the major costs of the project, but we were dealing with CN's main line in a couple of the cases, and so they don't allow any new at-grade crossings anyway. So we had to do some sort of a grade separation. But when you're dealing with 30 or 40 trains a day, you really need to do that. That's probably all I have.
Jack, we did talk a little bit about constrained areas and mitigating delays, not just with respect to railways, but generally?
Yes. Well, it's, I think like I said before, it's not the first time a BRT crossed a grade crossing a railroad track. So it, how you mitigate is first understand how big the problem is and do a train count, figure out how, we actually in Indianapolis, I'm running a project now where we went out and measured each train, how long it took to cross the tracks, how long the train was, and anywhere from 3 to 2.5 minutes to 7 minutes was sort of the average. And if it's 12 or 16 trains a day, that's manageable if you have a 10-minute headway. So at a 5-minute headway, it's a little bit worse. The BRT vehicles will bunch up a little bit, but they'll redistribute. If you have 50 trains a day or have a slow train that takes 18 minutes to get through, then you look at a grade separation. And maybe not in the near term, but at some point in your design, you might think about arching over that thing at some point. Other constrained areas, and I guess I have to reiterate that it's really tempting to say, well, it's such a very difficult intersection. There's no way to make room anywhere. And so we're just going to make it mixed traffic. And I said, like I think in Leeds, England, where they only did spot improvements at congested intersections. They did a bypass lane. That's all the money they had, but that was enough to make the BRT work functionally and reliable, because between the intersections, it was pretty free flowing, so they were able to use the general purpose lane. So even in these tight areas, I still reinforce that that intersection is not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. And so even more emphasis to maybe do a simple, what's called a bidirectional lane, just for 200 or 300 meters, just to get through that choke point. It's not perfect, but it's better than trying to use mixed traffic, and I hope it's going to work out as not really your long-term solution. So I guess I'm a little strict about making sure we try to get that choke point figured out and try to get exclusive lanes somehow, some way through there where it's reversible bidirectional.
Just quickly, on the Viva project, there are some instances where we run into grade separations or bridges that we just couldn't touch, either because of permitting or it's just way too high a cost, where we have implemented the bidirectional lane that Jack was just talking about, and it's worked great. So there's live examples out there that can be referenced if you guys are interested.
Councillor Helmer?
Thank you. I just have a feeling we're kind of winding down, and I didn't want to lose the benefit of everybody's expertise. So, you know, this is our first big major rapid transit project in the city, and it's perceived as a huge project because it's the biggest one we've done. It's all added up together, 10 years of construction and everything onto one big number. And I know you've worked on projects all over the country and some places, you know, in the United States. I wonder if you could just put our project in context of all the other things that you've worked on or are seeing happening around the country. I know it goes from like Eglinton Crosstown, you know, $9 billion, that's a big one, down to, you know, some things that were smaller, like Mississauga was a little bit cheaper than what we're proposing with the Transitway. And especially from a kind of cost per kilometer kind of perspective, because there's a big range there. And I wonder if you could speak to the kind of, on the capital side, the value for money of doing something like this, the way we're proposing to do it versus, you know, later when the city's more built out and it's more expensive and more constrained. And
well, I'll start. In the United States, I scrap for every square meter of land and pavement, and so I'm always trying to fit 12 pounds in an 8-pound bag in an arterial. And and in Canada, my observation is you guys do it right. You know, you know, exclusive running ways, which is very important for at least 70 or 80% of the corridor length. You put in nice stations and, you know, with the right amenities. And I think that's going to pay off. And I mean, I look at your systems here in both Winnipeg and others, and they're showcase BRT projects. You know, I wish I had the opportunity to do that in the States. Maybe half a dozen get that way in the United States. So I'm biased, first of all. So, but your network of 28 kilometers is a pretty good first start. Typically, we see smaller ones as starter lines. And so it's a big one for your first network. So you're doing a network all at once. And I'm used to doing 2 or 3 quarter, 1 quarter at a time. But I think the way your network's set up, and it's gonna make sense when it's all implemented all at the same time. Cost per mile, if you can try to, not do too much widening, just a modest amount of right-of-way, it's the right design, I've noticed. So I'm confident that it's going the right direction. It just, as you advance the design, you're gonna have issues, you're gonna have trade-offs. Do I, spend the money on a full acquisition here, or do I, go mix traffic just for a little bit of room here? And but it has to be tested with traffic modeling at each step of the way, so it's a very iterative process. And you come through, well, if I do this, I'm gonna test it with traffic modeling. Okay, that's not gonna work, so I might have to buy the land and make an extra GP, general purpose lane, or right-hand turn lane. So you're heading the right direction. It's in the right, bracket of cost per mile, pardon, that I've seen. That's my assessment.
Did anyone else have an answer? Because y'all had really excited faces when he asked that question.
Councillor Squire.
One of the challenges in this project, from my point of view, is what I would call BRT fatigue. I've been hearing about BRT since I got elected. All the meetings I go to, people talk about BRT. When I have a public meeting, people yell at me about BRT. And I know, only a politician would understand what that's like. I don't think people who work in a city can fully understand that unless they're experiencing it. That being said, how do I convince people in this city who say to me all the time, this is old technology? This is old technology. What are you doing in other areas? And how do I talk to a fellow today, for instance, who I met, who said, why you're doing all this work on BRT and you're not doing anything for bikes? You're not doing really good work for bikes. What about autonomous vehicles? What about ride sharing? So how do you talk to people and say to them, this fits in with a broader picture of transit in a city?
I know Winnipeg went through quite a few gyrations over the last while, from elevated gondolas to all sorts of technologies, and probably Bjorn has some thoughts, not specifically on the technologies, but just how to respond to the next big idea or old technology.
I'd say it's an unfair assessment to take a look at buses as old technology. Buses and rail each have their own place. They each do different things. They each are suited to different types of land uses and carrying different numbers of passengers. And it's wrong to think of it as rail is the best and bus is a compromise, because for our corridor that we're building right, or continuing to build right now in Winnipeg, if we had chosen rail, it would have been the wrong choice because of the volume of passengers that were on there. We wouldn't need rail. And also the lack of flexibility, because we needed the ability to have the buses leave the transitway. So it's all about what land use you're trying to serve and what your service model is going to look like. And then thinking about, the effects of things like autonomous vehicles and cycling, we have to look at how there's a real shift coming in the transportation world now, where it's not going to be, it's not just buses and public transit. There's a whole spectrum of things now. So autonomous vehicles, sure, but do you mean personal autonomous vehicles? Do you mean a car share autonomous vehicle? Are you going to have feeder services provided by autonomous vehicles that are taking you to transit stations or to even just major transit stops? So this is whole spectrum now where you're going to be dealing with, some of it's going to be autonomous vehicles, you're going to be having people walking and cycling to your stations, you're going to have different types of transit service, I guess sort of different levels, community feeder buses, slightly larger feeder routes, your regular transit service, express transit service, rapid transit service, all these types of things. So this, because you have this whole spectrum, really that's what we need to be planning for. And so it's not about what are you doing about this, or by building bus rapid transit, you're ignoring all those other things. Bus rapid transit is one tool, and its role really is to carry a lot of people along your major corridors. It won't solve all your problems in the first mile, last mile, way out at the end of the terminal. So don't look to it to do that. There's going to be other things that you'll be needing to look at down the road. But bus rapid transit is an important tool for solving this particular problem.
I might add a bit. It's, I did a lot of light rail design in Portland for the last 25 years and streetcar design. And 16 years ago, I did the first BRT line in Eugene, Oregon. And it's, to me, it's more like preserving a corridor. So if you think about it in terms of preserving a corridor, no matter what you put in that corridor is your future, because you can put autonomous vehicles in that corridor at some point. Light rail is 4 times the cost of BRT per mile. The streetcar's about a third, or almost twice the cost nowadays. So the bang for the buck for BRT is amazing and good, but I never try to oversell BRT. I've done all of them, and they all have their place. Ideally, you would like to, what I call preserve a corridor for flexibility for future mode shift to maybe light rail or streetcar. You know, maybe 15 years or 20 years, you convert the fleet over, but you've preserved the corridor to have the flexibility, and you've leveraged that by doing it now. So like he said, we can't, the first and last mile is always gonna be a conversation, autonomous vehicles and bikes and so forth. But buses are not old anymore. They're 18 or 24 meters long. They're all electric BYD vehicles, low floor, with all the comforts and air conditioning and heaters that we have. And if you didn't look at the wheels, you would see you could actually see a streetcar or a light rail vehicle yourself. So I like to think of preserving the corridor, and again, don't oversell BRT. Thanks.
Oh, pardon me.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, I mean, I agree completely with what Jack and Bjorn said. But I think BRT fits in exactly with the future of transportation, that the world is going to mobility as a service. So you may not, in the future, you may not own a car, or you may only own 1 car instead of 2 cars. And mobility becomes integrated. So as Bjorn was saying, that first and last mile, especially at the extremities of your system, a lot of people may take a ride share to the BRT station and then transfer all as one service paid for through one phone app for both the ride to the station and then the ride on the BRT vehicle to, say, downtown, if that's their destination. Autonomous vehicles won't solve congestion, and there's some research to say that it'll actually add to congestion. Because it changes the way vehicles drive, and particularly in the downtown area. So I don't think the world should be looking for autonomous vehicles to solve congestion problems in congested areas. So there, BRT plays a very important role to carry a lot more people to the downtown area where you have those destinations.
Does anyone have further questions? Commissioner Shepherd?
Thank you. For a big project like this, I think I'm guessing in areas like York and Winnipeg, in a big project like this, incomplete information or misinformation held by the public can be a real hurdle into gaining public acceptance and public support. And we've experienced a lot of that. There's been an excruciating amount of misinformation out there, and it's really skewed where public support is sitting at the moment. So I look to you if you've gone through a similar time frame in your own project development, if you've got some advice for us on how we can turn that around a little bit.
We've got the same problem, so I'd like to hear from my colleagues about it.
I just have one quick thing. As I've been through a lot of projects and delivered and opened them up, is that initially the perception of the impact is a lot worse than reality. After it opens, it's a year later. I know it's hard to believe, and it's hard to convince someone of that. But I think it's easy to get tempted to go, people reacting to all the pitfalls of what could happen. and not see the opportunities or benefits. And one example is in Vancouver, Washington, they were going to reduce the station spacing, and we reduced it to almost to 50% of the stations that were existing out there in the corridor of fixed route buses. And I was scared to death that no one would ride in the BRT. And it turned out the station spacing was just really didn't have much of an impact, a mild impact, because the travel time savings and the speed, people are willing to walk to that next station. And we actually did the math of, where their existing stop was compared to what's the delta they'd have to walk extra to the new station, and it wasn't that dramatic. So if you put it in those terms and try to explain you're walking another 82 feet or 182 feet, I think they get used to that. And so I always come back with, I think the initial perception is always worse than what really happens as it's operating and after a year if it's operating. So those are milestones that I would track. But that's anecdotal. I can't help you with the details.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, with any project of this size, there will always be people for and against it, and as I said before, you'll hear a lot more from the people that are against it. It's just important to keep putting your message out there in as many forums as you can. To have those local meetings, to communicate with blogs and on all of social media and through your website and any form of communication you can, get your message out there. But I think the important thing to remember is, for the most part, you're not talking to those people who are truly against your project, because you'll probably never convince them. You're talking to the 95% of the rest of your population, or whatever the percentage is, that are either undecided, they're unsure, maybe they don't know enough about the project, or they are in favor of it. So there's always a broad spectrum from those that are very much in support to those ones that are very much opposed, and then there's a whole middle area that are uncertain, and those are the people that you're truly talking to.
I just remember, there's one piece of advice I can give is go out and see an operating system or three and talk to the peers. Don't let consultants tell you what's great or not great. I mean, talk to people that are operating the system, that own the system already. And so I did this for folks in Nashville, and they came out to the Northwest and saw operating systems, and the same thing with Kansas City, St. Louis, Utah. So they wanted to see firsthand how it operated, and they got a tour by the people that own it and the transit agencies that would, tell them, they'd shoot them straight at what they would do and what they do differently if they do it over. So I know those junkets are inexpensive, but I think they're helpful to anybody, and I would suggest you use a cross-section of people in the council, the group, stakeholders, people that might be maybe against it. They don't go as a group and look at this as a uniform group of people to get the information firsthand.
Any further questions? Eric?
So you've mentioned constantly adding new lines and things like that to your existing ones, and you've watched, BRTs expand by adding lines. Just wondering what your gut feeling would be for our system, and how long, because we're kind of jumping out there and throwing like a massive network right away, how long do you think until we'll add new lines to this? Just out of curiosity.
When the first lines are successful. I kid, but the kernel of truth is that your first line has to be successful, and people in that vehicle, and newspaper articles about, your ridership and your increase, month after month after month. And I think it becomes easier and easier to add lines, politically speaking, as people start to use the system. And then I've seen situations where then other neighborhoods are sort of fighting for their corridor to be next. So.
Bjorn can probably comment, because you are working on different implementation plans and have a system built and are planning and forecasting new lines. So maybe you can provide some timelines on that. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
That's a tough question, because it's all subject to council approval. we have about a 20-year build-out plan for our rapid transit network. But we're not trying to tackle things quite in the way that you all are here. So I don't know if I can answer it in exactly the same way, but to echo on what others were saying, really people have to see it in order to understand it. When we were first proposing our first leg of our BRT corridor, it was, no matter how many drawings we showed and animations and things like that, no matter how many public engagement sessions we did where we went and talked about it, people have a lot of trouble really visualizing what it's going to be like and how it's going to affect their daily commutes. That's why it's, like they said, it's so important to make your first one successful, and then people can see it, they can understand it, and suddenly there's people who really want to see this in other areas of the city. So we built our first corridor, and it was a success. Especially for the people who are using it on a day-to-day basis, the people who live in all the other areas of the city, they still have the attitude, well, it didn't help me, so why should I have to care? But then there's other people who take it on occasion and realize, hey, well, why don't you start working on this one out to the east or the west end of the city instead of just the south? So it's getting people to understand it and see it that's the key thing that builds momentum for actually being able to do it.
If I can add, I think it's a continual process, like you're never finished, right? That every few years, it'll be time again to update your transportation master plan, to again look at a longer horizon and see what's in the future for London, for the next 10-year time increment. In York Region, for our main corridors, the funding that we have right now pays for about half of our initial implementation of rapid transit, of BRT. We're still seeking the funding to complete those current corridors, but in the meantime, our transportation master plan has been updated and added additional corridors in that very long time frame, 2031 to 2041. So those corridors, we haven't even started the planning process or the environmental assessment, so they're even way behind where you're at. But our initial corridors are ahead of where you're at. As you're implementing this first phase, you'll then be looking at the future beyond that, and do we need to extend them, or is there additional corridors that we should be operating in?
I'm just going to ask the one question because we were prompted to kind of ask it and nobody did. So why is middle better than the side?
Because there's no interference with traffic. You're truly separated. When you're on the side, you'll always have right turns in those lanes. You can't avoid the right turns when you're in the curbside. So you'll always be competing with regular traffic and running into congestion. And it's also the safety aspect of the vehicles merging in the lane that the bus is operating in. And did they check to see if a bus was coming up behind them before they made that that merge to the right to make a right turn at the next intersection? Whereas when you're in the middle and you've eliminated left turns, there's no conflict at all with regular traffic.
I'd add quickly, even conflicts with pedestrians and cyclists, if you have those facilities going in there, greatly reduced when you put them in the middle, obviously, right?
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. So if we're taking some lanes, then there may be traffic kind of bleeding off into the residential areas. Those kinds of things are anticipated. Are there things you do to mitigate maybe the negative impacts of that?
Yeah, traffic infiltration, particularly in Newmarket, when we were doing our Davis Drive project, was a very big issue with the community, and we worked extensively with the local council and ratepayers to try and do that during construction. Now that it's been complete, I mean, there were concerns before we started the project that there would be a lot of traffic infiltration after we were completed, and to a large extent, those concerns have gone away. The traffic isn't infiltrating through those neighborhoods to any great extent. So it is, there'll be a lot of perception that it will be a huge problem, but our experience is that, you know, after the construction period, it comes back to that arterial road. And there may be some impact during construction as people are trying to avoid that construction zone, you know, to find a shorter route somewhere. But, you know, you can do things to mitigate, you know, we just put up signs and say local traffic only. It's not enforced, but it does serve as a deterrent to, for some people to shortcut through a neighborhood. We do things like that together with the local council and the local ratepayers.
Thank you. Another question then, just asking about what are some small details that are important that you might not think of during the design phase? So there was a comment here on the fact that we may have to accommodate taxis or Ubers dropping people off at one of the stations. That may likely happen. Somebody wants to be taken to a particular stop. That might be something that we would need to think about. Are there other little details like that have come up?
Bike parking at stations is an important thing. Even if you have bike racks on all your buses, the most you can fit is generally 2 bikes on the front of a bus. So having not just bike racks, but bike lockers where people can feel safe, that they can use a proper U-lock, their bike is hidden away. That is an important thing for helping with the first mile, last mile problem, because people feel a lot more comfortable taking their bike to a rapid transit station if there's some place where they know they can lock it up securely.
Okay, I have a few questions. Oh, go ahead, Councillor.
I just, I know that at least in Winnipeg, there's an electric bus pilot underway. I know that it's come up in some of the comments so far in response to other questions, but that's something we're considering as well for the rapid transit fleet, is whether we're gonna have the run as electric vehicles or not. And I wonder if the panel could speak to sort of where you see electric vehicles heading and some of the trade-offs that come from an operational perspective, depending on how you're doing the charging and the kind of station requirements you need at the facility to charge them and those kind of pieces.
So I'm the project manager for what's called the Purple Line in Indianapolis right now. We're about 30% design, but their network, a 3-corridor network, is one's being under construction right now, and they're using all electric BYD vehicles. And the idea is that they have the range of 200 plus 300 miles to run all day without recharging. They have installed charging stations in their main facility. And the same idea is happening in Albuquerque, all electric vehicles. So that's the cutting edge thing. That's the next thing that's going to happen for this mode of transit, is that either through inductive charging, where you top off your charge at every 10th, 5th station, or terminus charging for 20 minutes and you slip in another vehicle ahead of it, or your charge lasts all day for a range and you just charge overnight at the main facility. That battery technology is just going to keep improving. And it's having some initial fits and starts, but I see that as something that you'll see in the future, just like vehicles. I think those vehicles are about $1.3 million a copy. They're about $200,000 to $300,000 more, but I think the technology is going to get to a point where you'll be seeing those almost exclusively. I think New Flyer is coming out, that one in Winnipeg also. So as they get tested, I see that low sulfur or diesel hybrid is going to still be on the scene, but at some point I think you can safely say that BRT will be all electric, you know, in the next 10 years as a standard.
I think this is a question that's really, it's apart from all the rapid transit questions, but I'd say don't discount what a fundamental change electrification is to the whole transit business. It's going to be a very difficult and complicated change to get there, but I agree with what Jack was saying, that really this is the way the transit's going, where over the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see a significant amount of increase in the number of electric buses that are on the road. But for the buses themselves, it seems like batteries are going in 2 different ways. You can have very large or very heavy batteries where a bus can be out all day. Now for all day, most of the manufacturers now on the street. So instead of having for example, our largest garage, like I was saying, you really need to rethink the entire business because you also need new facilities for how you're going to maintain them, new people for maintaining them. There's different training for all the drivers because they have to be involved in the charging process. How you schedule it because of the different batteries, that's a complication as well because right now, where we basically have an all diesel fleet, any bus can go into any route, doesn't matter. But if we have to start picking and choosing where, these 20% of buses can only go on these particular routes where they're not out for any more, or they can always charge within an hour and a half, it's a really complicated thing and there's no consensus on where it's going to go. Thankfully, there's a couple of major research projects going on in Canada that are taking a look at these type of things, but there's no answer yet. It's going that way. I think everybody can see it, but there's definitely no answer just yet.
Thank you so much. I'm really surprised at how much our experience has mirrored Winnipeg's, from everything from planning to reaction to council, all of that. So it's been interesting doing some research on what you've gone through to get to where you are today. And one of the primary goals of transit, apart from moving people efficiently and reliably, is the development aspect to it. And I noticed in some of your work, the Southwest Transit Way in the first development, even just slightly before and now, up till now, you have at least 3 major developments, one of 1,000 new dwellings in Fort Rouge Yard, is that correct? 2 new mixed towers and 1,300 residential units approved and ready to go, or they may already be built by now, I don't know. So I found it really interesting, your process in getting the development community together and on board with this, as well as with your downtown and the transit-oriented development summit. I thought was genius. It was a great way to introduce the community, the developers to the plan and the people working on the plan. My question is, now that you're in the second stage and you've started these huge infrastructure projects like the overpass and the park and ride, have you got any new development in that area that you can share with us or expectations of it in the next while?
Yes, if you look at our city master plan, there's a few major redevelopment sites, and Fort Rouge Yards was one of them. It's a former CN rail yard, but it's adjacent to the BRT corridor, and that's where there's a fair bit of development going on right now. There's 2 other major redevelopment sites. One's called the Parker Lands, and the other, we call it the Sugar Beet Lands because it used to be a sugar beet processing center that was there. There's nothing being built yet, but the developers that own both of those are right now going through all of their approval processes and their design processes so they can start building. And these are at least on the scale of Fort Rouge Yards and the Sugar Beet Lands. It's going to be not just residential, but also a significant amount of commercial and even some light industrial, just because it's a massive property. So we're seeing that already. And then a third major redevelopment site is a former golf course that the BRT corridor now runs through. It's adjacent to the University of Manitoba. The university bought that land. The golf course moved to a different location outside the city, and now it's part of the university's master plan, so it's up to them to go through this whole development process. So if they can raise the funds for their capital program, they'll start building basically their own transit-oriented village that's part of the campus. So with those 3, there's really a lot going on. And then there's some other opportunities in and around the corridor, and when you think of TOD, it's not always just mixed use, residential and retail. We've got, there's a major industrial area, sort of not huge factories, but light industrial that 2 of the stations on the corridor serve. We're already, we're hearing talk of some of the developers wanting to expand, but towards the stations, just because they have so many workers that are taking the bus to get to work every single day. So you don't think of industrial as TOD, and in a sense, it's not really, in terms of it being dense development. But these industrial areas really depend on us to get their employees there, so they benefit from it as well. It's also really helpful that in that it creates two-way traffic where you've got a lot of people that might be heading from residential areas in the south end of the city towards downtown. But because the university's down there, you've got students heading south, but you've also got workers heading in both directions to this industrial area that's in the middle of the corridor. So it kind of keeps it balanced, so you're not just running full express buses in one direction and then empty the other way to go back and pick up more people.
Thank you. So that leads into my next question regarding the is it EcoPass or EcoPass?
EcoPass.
EcoPass, which is a really impressive program. And my question is, have you seen an uptake in participation in that program through your industrial areas with the rapid transit?
I have no idea, actually. But my contact info is in the presentation. Email me and I'll find out for you.
Thank you very much. And does anyone mind if I keep going? I just have a couple more. In regards to park and rides, and this is more for Mr. May. I noticed in Viva, you have numerous park and rides, obviously, because you're such a big space. And what I was surprised to learn, but those aren't part of your transit system. They're independently owned or operated? Is that how that is?
YRT has arrangements with a number of individual property owners, malls and different places like that, where they will allow some commuter parking that's close to stops or Viva stops. So wherever possible, they've tried to take advantage of those. We do own some pieces of property in a few locations, and it is part of our plan to start implementing additional park and ride lots ourselves. But so far we haven't. So it's all been through those kind of arrangements, or in some cases they're kind of informal arrangements as well, where property owners sometimes either they see some benefit or there's no disbenefit to allowing some people to park there and use some of their parking, especially like where there's a movie theater. They don't have many people there using that parking during the daytime. So if there are people parking and getting on transit there, it's not really an inconvenience to them.
So it's really good community partnerships with the different park and rides. That's great. And one further question. I can't speak for your cities and your municipalities. I can say in London that there is a severe stigma to taking public transit. And it's something that we're all working forward and trying to get through and trying to change that public perception. And my question to you is, do you face that stigma, having transit users? How do you break through that? And how do you ensure the public knows that it's a service that's for everyone, not just this group or that group?
Maybe if I can start, I mean, I think implementing the BRT was a big part of that step to making transit a more appealing form of transit. Before that, local YRT, although it was a good service, we didn't always pay that much attention to where the pedestrians were walking. They didn't always have a good sidewalk and a good waiting space. Sometimes the transit stop was just a sign on a pole and they're standing in a mud puddle waiting for the bus. And that really doesn't show any respect to the rider, that we're treating them as a second-class citizen that is being forced to use this form of transit rather than the respect that they really deserve. So giving them a nice, comfortable place to access the station, giving them a comfortable station to wait in for the vehicle, giving them the information about when that next bus is going to arrive, and then once they're on the bus, giving them information about when their stop is coming up. All that sort of thing, I think, helps to make it a more desirable form of transit rather than something I have to do because I have no choice.
If you make it attractive enough, people will use it as a choice. And that's the rider you're trying to encourage. I mean, besides the transit-dependent people that will use it no matter what. If the cost is low, the fare or reasonable, but like he said, if it's a comfortable experience and I mean, I equivalent to Uber, where the nice thing about Uber is you get in the vehicle, you get out of the vehicle, you're not paying a cab driver, it's all electronic, it's all in and out. And if you have a BRT that has anywhere 5 to 8 minute frequency, no one's gonna have to refer to a schedule, because to me, that's the sweet spot. If I don't have to try to look up a schedule or timetable, I'll just jump on, because I know the bus is gonna be there in anywhere 5 or 7 minutes. I can wait that long to get on the vehicle. And that's the hook. That's where people actually will get on the vehicle, they'll ride it, they'll go downtown, not worry about parking and get back on. And without consulting a schedule, if I had to figure it out, I would say, I'm just gonna take Uber, I'm gonna just, drive my car. But the value of BRT or any transit is the high frequency, the 5 to 8 minute thing, because they'll get on the platform and they'll wait and it's there. And so I've seen this happen many times where they'll just say, well, this is convenient, this is usable, and I get a nice comfortable seat and I'll just drive home, And so that's basically what she's saying, is that if you make it attractive enough, people will use it and they'll start using it more and more.
I would say the amenities, like these two have been talking about, are a very important thing. We've got, I think, nearly 900 bus shelters around the city, and about 120 of those are heated bus shelters. We would have a lot of people not choosing to ride transit if we didn't have that in the wintertime. And it gets blazing hot in the summertime too, so that offers some shade. Buses have improved substantially in even probably the last 5 years, I would say. They're not nearly as noisy. The seats are much more comfortable. They usually have tinted windows, so it's not, so much of a glare inside. It's really different. So as we replace our bus fleet over the next decade or so, I think you're going to see more people willing to take transit just because it's a more comfortable experience compared to the old, loud, shaky buses. But to back up to your previous question, I think park and ride is also an important thing to attract people to it, where it's not just the people who have to take transit. We as a city, I think we have about a dozen park and rides. We don't own a single park and ride. It's all partnerships with shopping malls, churches, community centers, people that have this unused parking during the day. Usually it's just the nominal $1 a year fee for a lease. We take care of some of the maintenance around it, and it's generally a good partnership, especially with some of the retail locations, because we provide them with shoppers, essentially. We've taken the view that owning large park and rides is not something we want to do, because first of all, it's not really our business to be operating parking lots. And secondly, it's a real land use killer when you have a massive park and ride. It's just, if you have that adjacent to a rapid transit station, you can have pretty much nothing else around there because it's a giant parking lot. The exception to that is that we're actually building our first 2 park and rides that are going to be gigantic land use killers, except they're underneath a hydro corridor where nothing else could be built anyway. So we took advantage of that to build these, mostly to serve all the people going to Winnipeg Blue Bomber games. People do still go to those despite our record.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up if anyone has any. Councilor Van Holst, one more question?
Thank you. So rolling out a rapid transit route, there's a few things that are going on. We talked about the increased frequency, the enhanced amenities, the dedicated lanes. Do we want to wait and give people them all at the same time, or just as they come, or should one happen before another?
It's a tough question, not knowing exactly the London context, but if anyone wants to describe any experience on phasing, go ahead.
I think build it all at once. Like, do the project, do it once, do it right, and then you're done, right?
Thank you. I'd be interested to know, just one final question, what you might have seen as the worst wrong RT decisions. So communities that did something and it just was not a good decision. What might that have been?
I would say watering it down to the point where there's not a whole lot of benefit, but then trying to brand it as though it's rapid transit. People lose confidence in the idea that it's rapid and reliable, and they just see it for what it is, just another bus service that is really prone to being hit off schedule because of congestion, but hey, you got a lot of nice branding at your stations and on your buses.
I think when you try to do a lot of kilometers at one time, but it's watered down, I would rather do, 2/3 of those kilometers, but have a high showcase, all automatic exclusive lane BRT, just like he said, that will attract those people. And the other extensions will happen. The funding will happen because people want them. So I try to tell people you need the sizzle and the substance when you do a transit project, a BRT, especially a BRT, because the sizzle is sort of the amenities and the exclusive lanes and the time savings and the nice station features. But the substance is the reliability and the travel time savings, because no matter how nice that BRT vehicle is or how warm that station is, when the concrete's dry and the paint's cured, if that vehicle is not reliable to get you downtown and save 20% of your time, or it's a night, or faster, you're going to get out of that vehicle and drive your car the next day. So it's substance and sizzle together.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Councillor Helmer, one last question.
Thank you, and I'm glad that you especially brought up reliability, and I wanted to ask about it because right now, as we all know, especially those of us who are on the Transit Commission as well, some of our busiest routes the reliability for them is really challenged in the peak periods, right? These are really busy routes. They're sometimes overloaded, crush capacity. Then we have some reliability problems because they're running in mixed traffic, obviously, with all the rest of the cars. And I don't know how much you know about our system, but we're talking like 55%, sometimes 60% reliability in the peak periods. So I know that you can't forecast it specifically, but could you give me a sense of the order of magnitude of improvements to reliability when you do things like dedicated lanes and transit signal priority, and you increase the stop spacing? Like the kind of BRT we're planning to roll out, what kind of reliability ballpark do you think we're going to be at?
Yeah, I don't have our latest stats, and I'd have to check on what the reliability is, but it is much greater. So, I think it's in excess of 90% that it's reliable and on time, on schedule.
Because you're basically having like mechanical problems and things like that are causing the reliability issues and not congestion.
Well, they're still traveling through signalized intersections, so there is transit signal priority, but depending on how they hit those signals and whether there is that opportunity for the signal to react, they may fall a little bit behind schedule. The system is designed so that if they start to fall behind schedule, they get a more aggressive form of transit signal priority to help them to catch back up and get back on schedule.
So when we measure reliability in a fixed bus system, we measure it against the timetable in the schedule. And so it's on time or 30 seconds late or 2 minutes, 2 minutes running hot. When you do a BRT, the operational protocol changes where now it's called a headway-based schedule. So there is no schedule, there is no time stop, unless it's at downtown hub. It's all headway-based, so it'd be 5 minutes or 7 minutes headway. So the only issue is bunching when you have 5 or 6 minutes. So you might have 2 BRTs 3 minutes apart, and the next one's 6 minutes apart. So that's how they have to have a new measurement dimension of how I identify that. But yeah, 2 minutes sounds like, forever when you're waiting, at a station at a 5-minute frequency, but it's not. But so as long as it's 5 minutes or 7 minutes, that still is the sweet spot where you don't have to resort to a schedule and you're not going to walk off the platform. So
just going to add quickly an indirect benefit. aside from transit, is EMS vehicles too. So you put the transit way there, all of a sudden you've opened up a free corridor for them to get around, especially in those congested downtown areas where you didn't before, right? So added benefit.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been very insightful and very enlightening, and I know it's been a very long day for you too, and to give us 2 hours of your time, it's greatly appreciated. So on behalf of the Rapid Transit Implementation Working Group, thank you, and have a safe travel back to your cities. Do we have any other business to add? No? Can we move to adjournment? Oh, so yes, we will receive the report from our peer panel. Can I have a mover and a seconder? Councillor Van Holst and Councillor Park, all in favor? Thank you. And we'll move to adjournment. Councillor Helmer? Commissioner Shepherd, all in favor? Thank you very much. Just a reminder, our next meeting is March 8th. It will still be at 4:30, still on Thursdays.